Hey, what's up, Crossroads family? Today, I'm out here on the Murdoch Trail, just outside of town. And I'm out here today just to mix it up for a few different reasons. But one of which is because there's something that's just peaceful about the outdoors. But you know what? There's more than just an environmental peace that we can find. Sure, there are places that help us cultivate this attitude of peace, but that's just stuff that the world offers. Sure, gifts of God, yes, but you see, God talks about a peace that takes us and that goes beyond anything the world can offer. And that's what I want to look at today. You know, we have a great example of that, just even in Jesus. There's a story, in fact, it's one of my favorite stories of Jesus. It's in Matthew 8, it's in Luke 8, but I want to read it as it appears in Mark chapter 4. It's quite possibly a familiar story, and we find it in Mark chapter 4, verse 35 through 41. I'm going to read it for us. It says, that day when evening came, he said, that's Jesus, said to his disciples, let us go over to the other side. Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along just as he was in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, Teacher, don't you care if we drowned? He got up, rebuked the wind, and he said to the waves, Quiet, be still. Then the wind died down and it was completely calm. He said to his disciples, Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? They were terrified and asked each other, Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him. I love this picture. This picture of Jesus at complete peace. There's a storm raging around him. Water is getting thrown into the boat. We got to remember, these are professional fishermen. They've been out on sea a time or two in their lives. They know their way around fishing in boats. When they said, we thought we were going to drown, I mean, this means this was a pretty bad storm. And there's Jesus, asleep. Of all things, asleep. How can that even be? And so what do? There's a peace that Jesus had that was so far beyond anything that anybody had ever seen before. Even his disciples called it apathy. Don't you care if we're going to drown, Jesus? They begin to attack Jesus' character because they'd never seen a peace like that. A peace that could transcend a physical storm, water dumping in the boat. And then he napped. I love to just like picture what that would have been like, right? Like as Jesus gets up and he, wipes the sleep out of his eyes. And then with authority, peace, be still. And I wonder if he just laid back down and went back to sleep or something. I mean, how tough is that, right? Like none of this matters. He can calm the winds and the waves with his voice. But now here's the thing. What we see in that kind of peace, God wants to offer to you and me too. In fact, it's there for us. Those of us who've given our lives to Christ, again, this is part of the John 10:10 life. When Jesus said, I've come that you'd have life and you'd have it to the fullest. See, this kind of peace is available to you and to me. You know, there's a lot of people who want to read verses like this and they want to just claim the promises of God, that there's this peace that transcends understanding. But what's interesting is what we find in Philippians chapter 4 is it says, and the God of peace. Meaning there's something that comes before this. Yeah, there's a peace available to you, but there's something that comes on the front end before we begin to experience that peace. You see, yeah, obviously God can abruptly speak into the storms of your life and cause peace. But he very rarely just instantaneously speaks peace into your heart. And now I know what you're saying. I understand that there are moments that we can experience this true peace where we get away with Jesus and man, he all the worries and all the stress and all the anxiety and all the fears begin to just melt in his presence. That's a wonderful, wonderful thing. What I'm saying is, as you're focused on the world and focused on the problems and focused on the chaos and focused on all these things, it's very rarely just in the midst of being consumed with all these things that would just like out of the blue, boom, peace. See, it doesn't usually work that way. You see, even when we do find those places in the presence of God or with Jesus, when all the other things seem to melt away, that peace happens because we followed his lead, right? Matthew 11:28 and following, he says, come to me. Jesus says, come to me all who are weary, and I'll give you rest. That peace didn't come from nowhere. It came because we followed that lead of Christ. So yes, we do, as we follow his lead, come into his presence, and we find rest for our souls like he promises. You see, but have you ever done this before? Where you have that time with God, you get away to be with him, you find that refreshing, that true peace where all the other concerns begin to melt away, but then you get up from that place with Christ, you go back out into your relationships, you go back out into your workplace, you go back out and into the world, you pop on the news one more time, and all the fear and all the anxiety and all the worry and all the anger starts to just come right back. Man, I've been there before, but what I'm saying is this, is when Jesus promises peace, he doesn't promise that, hey, if you pray this prayer and accept me into your life, then instantly you'll know peace every moment of your life. See, that's not actually the way that it works. Yes, it's available to you, but he says, come follow me and I will teach you how to live a life that constantly produces peace. You see, there's some things in his word that if we follow his pattern and if we follow his example, there is peace that can be had. You see, coming into the presence of God and spending that time with him, man, that's the first step in this journey of recognizing and living in the peace that is made available to us. But Jesus says, come follow me and I'll show you how to walk in this every day. You know, we look at the story of Jesus in the boat and the disciples, and we so quickly judge the disciples, don't we? At least I do, right? Like, come on, guys, how are you freaking out? Jesus is in the boat. But I wonder if those same guys are looking down from heaven now at our lives, at 2020, and going, come on, guys. How are you still freaking out when Jesus is in your boat? Right? Well, the key, I believe, to understanding this life in Christ, is one of the first keys, the first step, is to recognize and never forget that though I might be in a storm, Jesus is in my boat. Maybe that sounds cheesy or cliche, but the reality is this. He sees the storm you're in. He knows the storm you're in. But just because Jesus isn't freaking out doesn't mean that he doesn't care, that he's gone, that he's checked out. You see, that's what the disciples thought about Jesus in the boat. You're sleeping, they're asleep, therefore you don't care. And I know a lot of us right now, we found ourselves in places where we go, man, like it just seems like God is so far from me right now. It just seems like he just doesn't care, or God's losing control. Listen, he's not lost control. And just because he's sleeping doesn't mean he doesn't care. What it means is he's just not as fearful as you are, because he knows his power. And he knows that the storm that you're in is not going to question his authority. The question is, do you and I realize that? The question is, do we live our lives in such a way where we can have confidence and security, knowing that though the storms of life are raging around me, Jesus is in the boat, and if he's sleeping, then I know everything is okay. Because he's here. And he has the power to speak peace into any situation. But more than just speaking and forcing his peace into me, he says, come follow me. Let me teach you what it looks like to live in peace. Hey, so let's jump back into Philippians chapter 4. You see, like I said, it starts out in Philippians chapter 4, verse 7, and the peace of God, and the peace of God. See, this isn't just with peace, but rather there's so many times where I want to claim the promises of God. But we don't realize that some of these promises are if-then statements. They're if-then types of promises. And it's not that God's like, if you perform, then I'll do a favor for you. That's not it at all. But again, it's like, hey, come follow me and I'll teach you how to live a life that produces peace. But it's with so many of these things. The joy of the Lord is my strength. I can say that all day long, but until we begin to put principles of our life that cultivate an attitude of joy in us, we can claim them all day long, but he wants to teach us how to live them. You see, peace is the same way. We can claim the promise. We can pray the promise of a peace that transcends understanding. But you ever done this before, right? Like, I'm just going to try to force myself to be peaceful. Okay, just peace. Okay, stop worrying, just peace. It never works. And then you start getting anxious about not having peace, even though you're trying to have peace. Like, it just doesn't work. But there is something that does work. You see, I think Paul is teaching us just that. Well, what does this life of peace really look like? So let's back up and read what comes before it. What we're after is a peace that transcends understanding, a peace that blows your mind, a peace that our unbelieving friends can't even begin to comprehend. It says this is where it comes from. Philippians 4:4 says, rejoice in the Lord always. I'll say it again, rejoice. I love that. I love that. Rejoice in the Lord. How often? Always. Always rejoice. Let me ask you this. Can you rejoice and complain at the same time? You can't. And how often are we supposed to rejoice? Always. Listen, if you're complaining, you are not living the life that Christ died that you would live. You are not living the fullness of life. If you're complaining at all, ever, you're not living the fullness of life. Paul says, rejoice. Rejoice in the Lord always. And then he's like, in case you missed it, I'll say it again. Rejoice. This is vital. This is important. But here when we talk about it in the context of the storm, right? But you don't know the storms that I'm facing. If you weren't to know the storyline of Paul, the guy who's writing this, you'd think he'd never had a hard day in his life. How do you tell me to rejoice all the time? When we start thinking about the fact that he's writing this from prison, and that's the least of the struggles that he's lived his entire life. He's known heartache after heartache after heartache after heartache. And here he is in prison, chained to a Roman guard, writing, rejoice. Don't forget this. I'm going to say it twice. Rejoice. Rejoice all the time. But let's just be honest. When I'm in the storm that I'm in right now, this political uncertainty storm, it's hard to rejoice. Oh, when I'm in a health storm, maybe I've got COVID or my family members or loved ones are sick. I don't know how they're going to recover. Or maybe the storm of loss or maybe the continued storms that we're faced with the political unrest and you have to, or the racial unrest that you have to live with every single day or whatever. And it could be things that aren't related to 2020. Right, all these different things, these storms of life, these relational conflict storms, all these different storms. Like, how in the world am I supposed to rejoice in the midst of all of this? And yet, he says rejoice. In fact, that's just the first of 4 different commands that Paul gives us that precede this life of peace. Like, we want to chase peace, but there are these 4 commands that he's going to give us. And as we look, there's 4 commands and an attitude. Before we're going to know this life of peace, we've got to make sure that we know how to live the life of Christ that he's calling us to. First of all, we rejoice in the Lord. I'll say it again, rejoice. Second one, let your gentleness be evident to all. So first, he commands us to rejoice. Second, he commands us to be gentle. But you know how it goes, right? In a storm, all that angst and all that tension in our hearts, gentleness is not usually a normal expression of my heart in the middle of a storm. You know what comes a little bit more natural than gentleness? Short-tempered, right? Depression. Defensiveness, anger. See, these are the natural reactions when we find ourselves in a storm in the world that we live in. Paul says, no, none of that. Let your gentleness be evident to all. Not just gentle inside, but gentle towards others. He says, rejoice. He says, be gentle. Number 3, he says, don't be anxious about anything. Don't be anxious. Now that's just such, I always find, every time I read this, I think that's just such an interesting command. Don't be anxious. Well, the moment you try to force yourself to not be anxious, you become anxious about not being able to make yourself not anxious. It's just a vicious circle. So how do you just like, oh, I'm not going to be anxious when you're in the middle of a storm? He goes on. He says, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your request to God. That's number 4. Present your request to God. Present your request to God. Now, let's be honest, that's maybe the easiest one. In fact, I'd say these are continually easier and easier. It's not until we look at it backwards that we can really even begin. Like in the middle of a storm, I'm supposed to rejoice. I'm supposed to be gentle. I'm supposed to not be anxious, and I'm supposed to present my request to God. So let's just start. Let's start in reverse order here. Man, when you find yourself in a storm, anxiety is raging, gentleness is nowhere to be found, rejoicing is the last thing on your mind. Start with just presenting your request to God. Start with that. Because when you do that, here's a phrase that I skipped over as I was reading this. It's not really one of the commands, but he says right in the middle of this, let your gentleness be evident to all. The Lord is near. Do not be anxious about anything. See, he just drops that little statement in. The Lord is near. You know why? Because the same thing we learned when we saw the story of Jesus in the boat, right? Though I might be going through the storm, Jesus is in my boat. The Lord is near. It's a game changer. It's a game changer. And so when Jesus says, come follow me, I'll show you the way to peace. Like, here's the deal. The world's way of looking at it is when storms of life come, when conflict comes, when challenge comes, when loss comes, when fear starts working in, when all this unknown things start to throw themselves on us and thrust ourselves towards us, we tend to now look at our responses in light of those things, right? If this is going on, how can I rejoice? If this tragedy is happening, how can't I be anxious? How am I supposed to be gentle? How am I supposed to give these things to God when they're so all-encompassing? When our focus is on the trial, the challenge, the storm, these things seem impossible. But when our focus is on this one little phrase, the Lord is near, it changes everything. Right? The disciples in the boat, their focus was on the storm. If they had just taken a moment, step back and look, there's Jesus in the boat. We're going to be just fine. Yeah, this doesn't look good, but he's right here. If he's still sleeping, he's not worried enough to wake up, then I think he's still in control. Friends, I just want to remind you again, you may be in a storm, but Jesus is in the boat. Christian, that's the greatest blessing of a life with Christ here on earth, is that no matter what storm we go through, see, because Jesus doesn't promise the lack of storms. Read the Bible, and you can't read it in any way that is going to suggest that Jesus is going to take away all the storms of life. But he promises that he'll be there. And it's in that knowing that we begin to see how we can even begin to walk through any of these. So, with this mindset, that Christ is near, that the Lord is near, that Jesus is in the boat, we begin to present our request to God. God, I acknowledge you. And when I look at the world around me, I don't see you. When I look at the world around me, I don't understand why it seems like you're still napping, Jesus. But I know you're here. So God, here are my anxieties. Here are my fears. Here's my requests in the middle of this. And then we move on to the second thing. Don't be anxious. How do we not be anxious? Is because we look at this Jesus who's asleep in the boat. Man, if I truly understand that the Lord is near, if I truly get that he is near, why would I hold on to these uncertainties and allow them to rob me of joy? Why would I hold on to these anxieties, these stresses? Because he's here, and he promises to take these from us. So I'm going to choose not to be anxious about anything. In fact, it's my anxiety that causes me to not be gentle with the people around me. And so as I present my request to the Lord, I love how this works. I present my request to the Lord. My anxieties begin to subside because my focus is on Christ. And now as my anxiety begins to subside, my heart begins to soften. And now I can treat people with gentleness. Whereas before, they were either friend or foe. They were opposition, or they were just annoyance. But now I can begin to treat them like Christ, because my anxieties aren't bringing my emotional and my mental self to a max that I can't overcome. And so there's a gentleness that comes out of me. Now I realize this last one's still hard, but okay, how do I rejoice? how do I rejoice in the midst of this? See, here's the deal. There are people who are living this life and enduring some of the same tragedies and crises and all these things that we are, and yet they've never invited Christ into their life. They've never, and they have to navigate these challenges without God. Friends, in the midst of everything that has happened this year and all the setbacks you have ever faced, do not forget that Christ is still right there. And if we can't come to a point where we can rejoice in that, then we're not living the Christian life right. Because there's nothing greater. There is nothing in this world that we could possibly face, and no setback we could possibly face. There's no obstacle, there's no loss that we could ever face that comes close to the joy of knowing Jesus. So yeah, I don't want to downplay your setback. I don't want to downplay your loss. I don't want to downplay the storm that you are in. It's real. But can we not rejoice that Jesus is with us in the middle of it? Can we not rejoice that He's still sovereign and He's still in control? Can we not rejoice that in any given moment, so He choose, He could speak to the storm and it's gone? Friends, it's time to rejoice. So there's the 4 commands. Rejoice. Be gentle. Don't be anxious. Present your request to God. Well, like I said, there's 4 commands and 1 attitude. How are we supposed to present a request to God? It says, with thanksgiving. With thanksgiving. Friends, I believe that this one simple phrase is the key that unlocks this whole entire thing. If you want to come to a point where you are living, not just experience from moment to moment, just a moment of respite. I go to my quiet time. I experience the presence of God. It's wonderful. But then I go back into the rat race, and it's just like try to keep your head above water. Like there's a way to live the Christian life that's better than that. A way where rejoicing and gentleness and no anxiety and constant presenting your request to God. This is a normal way of life, but we've got to choose to live it. And I think the key in the whole thing is the attitude that Paul drops in there, is that thanksgiving. When you and I begin to choose to live our lives from a place of gratitude, when you and I choose to begin to see the grace of God more than the storms of the world, game changer. But it takes discipline and practice. It's one thing just right now to go, okay, I'm going to be grateful. But tomorrow morning when you wake up and you get bombarded with more bad news, somebody else you love has COVID, more political unrest, more hate and anxiety taking place in the world and on the news, whatever the storm might be, can you still choose to be thankful for the grace of God? Can you still recognize, God, your grace overwhelms me? The more we see the grace of God, the less we see the storms around us. That's what the disciples are missing in the boat. That's what they were missing. They forgot to stop and be thankful for the grace of God, that He was right there. He could have been anywhere, but He got in the boat with them. Friends, for those of us who've accepted Christ, for those of us who've yielded our lives to Him, what that means is that we've got some storms to navigate, but Christ is there with us. So what are you looking at today? Where is your focus? Is your focus on the storm? Friends, if you're focused on the storm, it's going to be nearly impossible to live a life of rejoicing and gentleness and no anxiety and presenting, nearly impossible. But if we can fix our eyes on the grace of God already received, if we can fix our eyes on the grace of God already received, friends, these are going to become second nature. And what happens when this begins to be not just something we discipline ourselves to do, but rather something that flows out of a heart of gratitude? Because they will. As we cultivate that attitude in us, we cultivate that gratitude within our hearts, and we discipline ourselves in the area of gratitude. Friends, those behaviors of presenting our requests to God and being gentle with one another and diminishing anxiety and rejoicing in the moment, as we begin to cultivate an attitude of this gratefulness and thankfulness, friends, peace begins to flow out. You see, no longer do we have to sit there and grit our teeth and, oh, I want peace, I want peace, I want peace, I want peace. No. Peace flows from a heart of gratitude as we begin to recognize God in the boat and not stress about what's happening around us.